Sarah Martinez stared at the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, her hands trembling as she read the bold red letters demanding payment within 72 hours. The single mother of two had been fighting this battle for months, juggling 3 part-time jobs while her ex-husband disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only empty promises and unpaid bills. Her savings account showed a devastating balance of $47, barely enough to feed her children for the week. The morning sun felt harsh against her face as she walked to her beat-up Honda, knowing today would bring another round of rejections from potential employers. At 34, Sarah had a college degree in social work, but the economic downturn had made steady employment nearly impossible to find. Every interview ended the same way, with polite smiles and promises to call that never materialized. Her children, Emma and Jake, had stopped asking about their father's return, sensing their mother's growing desperation. As Sarah drove through the winding mountain roads toward the Modoc County Social Services office for her appointment, she couldn't shake the feeling that this might be her last hope. The county had a program for struggling single parents, but the waiting list was long and the requirements strict. She had applied 6 months ago, submitted every document they requested, and attended countless meetings that led nowhere. The landscape around her seemed to mirror her emotional state. The drought had left the once green hills brown and barren, with dead trees standing like monuments to better times. Sarah had grown up in this area, remembering when the Native American communities in the town worked together more closely, when there was still hope for economic recovery after the lumber mills closed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her babysitter, Mrs. Chen, reminding her that rent for the small garage apartment behind her house would be due in 2 days. Sarah had been staying there since losing her main apartment, grateful for the elderly woman's kindness but knowing she couldn't impose much longer. The weight of disappointing everyone who had tried to help her pressed down like a physical burden. At the social services building, Sarah sat in the familiar waiting room with its faded motivational posters and worn plastic chairs. She had memorized every crack in the wall, every water stain on the ceiling tiles. Today felt different though, heavier somehow, as if the universe was preparing to deliver its final verdict on her struggling family. When her caseworker, Maria Rodriguez, finally called her name, Sarah could read the disappointment in the woman's eyes before she even spoke. The funding for the emergency assistance program had been cut, effective immediately. There would be no help coming, no safety net to catch her family as they fell. Maria handed her a list of food banks and homeless shelters, her voice gentle but defeated. Walking back to her car, Sarah felt something inside her break. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and it still wasn't enough. The parking lot seemed to spin around her as she leaned against her car, fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm her completely. For the first time since becoming a mother, Sarah began to seriously consider whether her children might be better off without her constant struggle and failure. The drive home passed in a blur of self-doubt and crushing despair. Sarah found herself taking the long way back, passing through the rural areas where the Modoc reservation bordered the county land. She needed time to figure out how to tell Emma and Jake that they might have to leave everything familiar behind, that their mother had failed them when they needed her most. As she rounded a bend in the dusty road, Sarah noticed smoke rising from a small clearing ahead. Her social worker instincts kicked in despite her personal crisis, and she slowed down to investigate. What she saw would change the trajectory of her entire life, though she had no way of knowing it in that moment of complete hopelessness. Through the windshield, Sarah could see a small campfire crackling in a cleared area surrounded by oak trees. What caught her attention wasn't the fire itself, but the figure sitting beside it. A man in his early 40s with long black hair tied back and weathered hands was carefully crafting something from a piece of wood. His concentration was so complete that he didn't notice her car pulling over to the shoulder of the road. Sarah hesitated before getting out, unsure why she felt drawn to stop. Perhaps it was the peaceful scene that contrasted so sharply with the chaos in her own life. Or maybe it was simple curiosity about what the man was creating with such obvious skill and patience. As she approached, she could see he was carving a small bow, the kind a child might use for play rather than hunting. The man looked up as her footsteps crunched on the dry leaves, his dark eyes showing wariness rather than welcome. Sarah realized she was probably intruding on private land and started to apologize, but he held up a hand to stop her words. His name was Thomas Crowfeather, and he explained that this land belonged to his family, passed down through generations of the Modoc people who had somehow managed to keep it despite decades of economic pressure. Thomas had been coming to this spot every day for the past month, he told her, working on various projects to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. Sarah noticed the sadness in his voice when he mentioned that his 8-year-old son, Danny, had been asking for a bow like the ones his ancestors used. The boy lived with his grandmother most of the time while Thomas worked construction jobs wherever he could find them. As they talked, Sarah learned that Thomas was facing his own struggles. The construction work had dried up with the economic downturn, and he was behind on payments for his truck, which he needed to travel to job sites. His son's mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving Thomas to navigate single parenthood while dealing with his own grief and financial pressures. Something about Thomas's quiet dignity and the gentle way he spoke about his son made Sarah feel safe enough to share her own situation. She found herself telling him about the eviction notice, the failed job interviews, and the crushing weight of feeling like she was failing her children. Thomas listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or offering a soft word of understanding. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when a young boy came running through the trees, calling out in what Sarah assumed was the Modoc language. This was Danny, Thomas's son, a small boy with bright eyes and an infectious grin who had been staying with his grandmother while his father worked on the bow. Danny switched effortlessly between English and his native language as he examined his father's handiwork. Danny was fascinated by Sarah's presence, asking her dozens of questions about where she lived, whether she had children, and what she did for work. His innocence and genuine curiosity were a welcome relief from the heavy conversation she'd been having with adults about money and survival. When she mentioned that she had a son and daughter, Danny's eyes lit up with excitement at the possibility of new friends. Thomas watched the interaction between his son and Sarah with growing interest. He could see that she was gentle with children, patient with Danny's endless questions, and genuinely engaged with his stories about school and his grandmother's teachings. There was something about her presence that seemed to calm the restless energy that had been building in both father and son since they'd been struggling alone. As the sky began to darken, Thomas offered to show Sarah some of the traditional plants his grandmother had taught him to identify for medicinal purposes. Walking through the small grove of trees, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. The simple act of learning something new, of being in nature with people who seemed to accept her without judgment, was like medicine for her wounded spirit. When it came time to leave, Danny surprised everyone by asking Sarah if she would come back tomorrow to see the finished bow. Thomas looked embarrassed by his son's boldness, but Sarah found herself agreeing without hesitation. For the first time in weeks, she had something to look forward to, a reason to get through one more difficult night. Driving home in the gathering darkness, Sarah felt a small spark of something she had almost forgotten existed. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was a break in the overwhelming despair that had been consuming her. She didn't know that tomorrow would bring a conversation that would change everything, or that a child's innocent words would open a door she never expected to find. Sarah arrived at the clearing the next afternoon, carrying a thermos of coffee and some homemade cookies she had managed to bake, despite her dwindling supplies. She had spent the morning dealing with another round of phone calls from creditors and had nearly talked herself out of returning. But something about the promise she had made to Danny kept pulling her back to this peaceful place. Thomas was putting the finishing touches on the small bow when she arrived, carefully sanding the smooth wood until it gleamed in the dappled sunlight. The craftsmanship was beautiful, clearly the work of someone who had learned traditional techniques and took pride in preserving them. Sarah could see generations of knowledge in every careful curve and precisely placed notch. Danny came bounding through the trees shortly after Sarah's arrival, his excitement obvious from 50 yards away. He had been telling his grandmother about the nice lady who had visited yesterday, describing her in the kind of detail that only children notice. His grandmother, Elena Crowfeather, was curious about this woman who had captured her grandson's attention so completely. The boy's joy when he saw the completed bow was infectious. He held it reverently, understanding even at his young age that this was more than just a toy. Thomas explained the significance of each part of the bow, teaching Danny about the wood selection, the importance of patience in crafting, and the responsibility that came with any weapon, even a child's practice bow. As Danny practiced drawing the bow with blunt arrows his father had also crafted, Sarah and Thomas continued the conversation they had started the day before. Thomas shared more about his struggles with single parenthood, particularly the challenge of keeping his son connected to their cultural traditions, while also preparing him for life in the modern world. Sarah talked about her fears of losing her children if she couldn't provide for them properly. The afternoon passed quietly, with Danny occasionally running over to show Sarah his improving technique with the bow. There was something healing about watching the child's uncomplicated joy, his ability to find wonder in simple things despite the difficulties his family faced. Sarah realized she had forgotten how to see the world through such optimistic eyes. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Thomas mentioned that his grandmother had invited Sarah to join them for dinner. Elena Crowfeather wanted to meet the woman who had brought such happiness to her grandson, and Thomas admitted he was curious to see how Sarah would respond to his family's traditional ways of living. The walk to Elena's small house took them deeper into the family's land, through areas where Sarah could see evidence of sustainable living practices that had been passed down through generations. There were gardens growing native plants, solar panels installed alongside traditional building techniques, and a sense of harmony between old and new that impressed her deeply. Elena greeted Sarah with warmth that immediately put her at ease. The elderly woman had intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through to Sarah's heart, but there was no judgment in her gaze, only compassion for another person carrying heavy burdens. The house was small but welcoming, filled with handmade crafts and family photographs that told the story of a people who had survived against tremendous odds. During dinner, Sarah found herself sharing more about her background than she had intended. Elena asked gentle questions that seemed designed to understand not just Sarah's current situation, but who she was as a person. The conversation flowed naturally between English and the Modoc language, with Thomas and Danny translating when necessary. After the meal, as the adults sat on the small porch watching Danny practice with his new bow in the yard, the conversation turned to deeper matters. Elena spoke about the importance of community, about how traditional Modoc families had always supported each other through difficult times. She mentioned that she had been worried about Thomas and Danny, seeing how they struggled without the support system that had once been stronger in their community. As the evening wound down and Sarah prepared to leave, Danny approached her with his bow in hand. His small face was serious as he looked up at her, considering his words carefully. The question he asked came out in a whisper, but it cut through the quiet evening air like an arrow finding its mark. The 8-year-old boy, holding his wooden bow with both hands, looked directly into Sarah's eyes and asked with startling directness, "Will you marry my father?" The silence that followed his question seemed to stretch forever, filled with possibilities that none of the adults had dared to voice, but that a child's innocent wisdom had brought into the open. The silence that followed Danny's question seemed to expand like ripples on a still pond, touching everyone present in different ways. Thomas's face flushed with embarrassment, and he immediately began to apologize for his son's boldness. But Elena placed a gentle hand on his arm to quiet him. The elderly woman's eyes were twinkling with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps recognition of a truth that the adults had been dancing around. Sarah felt her heart racing, not from offense or shock, but from the sudden realization that this innocent child had somehow seen something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. In just 2 days, she had felt more at peace in this family's presence than she had in months of struggling alone. Danny's question forced her to confront feelings she had been too overwhelmed to recognize. Danny himself seemed unaware of the gravity of what he had asked. To him, it was a simple solution to a problem he could see clearly with a child's uncompromised vision. His father was sad and lonely. This nice lady was sad and lonely, and they both seemed happier when they were together. In his 8-year-old logic, marriage was how adults fixed loneliness and created families. Thomas knelt down to his son's level and began to explain gently that marriage wasn't something you could arrange like a play date, that adults needed time to get to know each other properly. But Danny interrupted with the kind of devastating honesty that children possess, pointing out that his father smiled more in the past 2 days than he had in months, and that Sarah seemed less sad when she was with them. Elena broke the tension by suggesting they all sit down and talk about what Danny was really asking for. She explained to her grandson that he wasn't wrong to want his family to be complete, or to see that Sarah brought something positive into their lives. but she also helped him understand that grown-ups had complicated feelings and responsibilities that took time to sort through. As they talked, Sarah found herself really looking at Thomas for the first time, not as a kind stranger who had offered her temporary refuge from her problems, but as a man who might be facing some of the same challenges she was. She could see the loneliness in his eyes, the weight of trying to be everything to his son while dealing with his own grief and struggles. Thomas, for his part, was seeing Sarah differently too. Her gentle way with Danny, her genuine interest in their family's traditions, and her strength in the face of overwhelming difficulties painted a picture of someone who might understand the complexities of his life. He realized that he had been thinking about her constantly since their first meeting, wondering how she was managing and hoping she would return. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Elena guided them through a discussion about their respective situations, their hopes and fears for their children, and their dreams for the future that had seemed impossible just days before. There was no pressure, no romantic declarations, just an honest exploration of whether their lives might fit together in a way that would benefit everyone involved. Danny listened to the adult conversation with the intensity of a child who knows his future is being decided. He occasionally piped up with observations that showed he had been thinking about this possibility much longer than anyone realized. He had already imagined Sarah's children playing with him, had wondered if they would like to learn about bow-making and traditional stories, had even asked his grandmother if their house could be made bigger. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to see the possibility that Danny's innocent question had revealed, not a romantic fairy tale, but a practical partnership between two people who understood struggle and resilience. Thomas was offering not just emotional support, but a way of life that valued community and tradition over material success. His family's land, their sustainable lifestyle, and their strong cultural identity could provide stability for her children. Thomas was equally drawn to what Sarah could bring to their family. Her education and professional background, her experience navigating social services and bureaucracy, and her determination to provide better opportunities for her children complemented his own skills and values. More importantly, Danny had responded to her with an openness and trust that the boy had shown to very few people since his mother's death. When Sarah finally drove home that night, Danny's question echoed in her mind with increasing clarity. The child had asked not just about marriage, but about hope, about the possibility that broken families could heal by coming together, about whether love could be found in the most unexpected places during the darkest times. She spent the night thinking about her children, about whether this opportunity was something she could realistically consider, and about whether she was brave enough to take the biggest leap of faith of her life. By morning, Sarah knew that Danny's whispered question had changed everything, opening a door to a future she had never imagined, but desperately needed to explore. Sarah spent a sleepless night wrestling with possibilities that seemed both miraculous and terrifying. By morning, she had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She would bring Emma and Jake to meet Thomas and Danny, not to force anything, but to see if the connection she had felt might extend to their children as well. The conversation with her own children was more difficult than she had anticipated. 12-year-old Emma was suspicious of any change that might disrupt their already unstable lives, while 9-year-old Jake was simply excited at the prospect of meeting a boy who had his own bow and arrows. Sarah tried to explain the situation honestly, telling them about the kind man and his son who had shown her such friendship during a difficult time. Emma's questions were sharp and practical, reflecting the premature wisdom that comes from watching your parents struggle. She wanted to know if Sarah was thinking about marriage because she was desperate, whether this was about finding someone to rescue them financially, and what would happen if things didn't work out. Sarah answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging that their situation was desperate but insisting that her growing feelings for Thomas were genuine. Jake's concerns were simpler but equally important. He wanted to know if they would have to move away from everything familiar, whether the new boy would share his toys, and if Thomas would try to replace their absent father. Sarah assured him that no one could replace his father, but that sometimes families grew in unexpected ways that could make everyone happier. The drive to Elena's house was tense, with Emma maintaining a protective silence while Jake chattered nervously about what to expect. Sarah found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. asking for the wisdom to know if she was making a terrible mistake or the best decision of her life. Danny was waiting in the yard when they arrived, practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of meeting Sarah's children. Thomas stood nearby, clearly as nervous as Sarah about this crucial meeting. Elena emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade and wearing the kind of knowing smile that suggested she had faith in the outcome. The initial interactions were awkward, with Emma hanging back while Jake approached Danny with cautious curiosity. The two boys were soon examining Danny's bow together, with Danny explaining the craftsmanship with the pride of ownership. Emma remained aloof until Elena approached her directly, somehow recognizing that the older girl needed special attention. Elena began talking to Emma about the challenges of being the responsible one in a struggling family. Acknowledging the burden that oldest children often carry, she shared stories about her own childhood, when she had helped raise younger siblings during difficult times on the reservation. Emma found herself drawn into conversation with this wise woman, who seemed to understand her fears and responsibilities. Meanwhile, Thomas was showing Jake around the property, explaining the solar panels, the vegetable gardens, and the workshop where he crafted traditional items when he wasn't looking for construction work. Jake was fascinated by the combination of old and new technologies, asking dozens of questions about how things worked and whether he could learn to make things with his hands. The breakthrough came when Danny suggested they all work together to build a target for bow practice. The project required cooperation, with each child contributing their own skills and ideas. Emma found herself drawn into the planning despite her initial resistance, while Jake threw himself into the physical construction with enthusiasm. As the children worked together, the adults watched from the porch with growing amazement. Danny's natural leadership skills emerged as he guided the project, while Emma's organizational abilities helped keep everyone focused. Jake's enthusiasm and willingness to try anything new brought energy to the group. Most importantly, they were laughing together within an hour of meeting. Thomas and Sarah found themselves talking more openly than they had before, sharing details about their children's personalities, their hopes for their futures, and their fears about the challenges they would face growing up. They discovered that their parenting philosophies aligned in important ways, both believing in the importance of education, cultural identity, and teaching children to be responsible for their community. Elena spent the afternoon observing all of them with the sharp eyes of someone who had watched many families form and dissolve over her 70-plus years. She could see the way Thomas's posture relaxed when Sarah was near, how Sarah's face softened when she watched him interact with her children, and most importantly, how all three children seemed to naturally fit together as siblings. By evening, when it came time for Sarah and her children to leave, the dynamic had shifted completely. Emma was asking quiet questions about the school system in the area and whether she could visit Elena again to learn more about traditional crafts. Jake was making plans with Danny for the next day's target practice and begging his mother to let them come back soon. Most telling of all, Danny approached Emma before they left and quietly asked if she thought her mother would really consider marrying his father. Emma, with the seriousness of someone far older than her 12 years, told him that she thought their parents were falling in love, and that maybe sometimes children could see things that adults were too scared to admit. The drive home was filled with excited chatter from both children, their earlier reservations replaced by genuine enthusiasm for this new possibility. Sarah realized that her children had not only accepted Thomas and Danny, but were already beginning to imagine themselves as part of this larger family. The foundation for something real and lasting was being built not by the adults' careful planning, but by the natural connections forming between children who recognized kindred spirits. The wedding took place on Elena's land, just as the first winter snows began to dust the mountains, creating a backdrop that seemed designed for new beginnings. Elena had insisted on incorporating traditional Modoc ceremonies alongside the legal requirements, creating a blend of old and new that perfectly represented the family they were creating together. Sarah wore a simple white dress decorated with beadwork that Emma had helped Elena create, while Thomas wore traditional regalia that had belonged to his grandfather. Danny served as the ring-bearer with a pride that made every adult present smile through their tears. He had been telling everyone who would listen that his idea had worked out perfectly, and that he was going to be the best big brother to Emma and Jake that anyone could imagine. Emma and Jake stood beside Sarah as witnesses, their faces showing a contentment that had been absent for too many months. The ceremony was small, attended by Elena's extended family, a few neighbors, and the social worker who had become Sarah's friend through months of struggle. Maria Rodriguez cried openly as she watched Sarah exchange vows, remembering the desperate woman who had sat in her office just months earlier, convinced that hope was gone forever. Now Sarah glowed with happiness and security, surrounded by a family that had chosen each other through love rather than obligation. Elena spoke during the ceremony about the traditional Modoc belief that families are created not just by blood, but by commitment, shared values, and mutual support. She welcomed Sarah and her children into the family, with words that had been used for generations, formally adopting them into the tribal community and giving them a cultural identity that would enrich their lives forever. Thomas's vows focused on his promise to love and protect not just Sarah, but all of their children equally, to honor the memory of Sarah's previous marriage while building something new and strong for their future. Sarah's vows included her commitment to learning and preserving the cultural traditions that were so important to Thomas and Danny, and her promise to help their blended family stay connected to their roots while reaching for new opportunities. The reception was held in Elena's house, which seemed to expand magically to accommodate everyone. The children had worked together for weeks to prepare traditional foods and decorations, learning recipes and craft techniques that connected them to generations of family knowledge. Danny, Emma, and Jake moved through the celebration as a unified team, serving food, entertaining guests, and basking in the attention of adults who praised their cooperation and maturity. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, the new family gathered around Elena's fireplace to share their hopes and plans for the future. Thomas had been offered a permanent position with the Sustainable Construction Company, which would provide the steady income they needed while allowing him to work on projects that aligned with his values. Sarah had accepted a job with the County Social Services Department, where her personal experience with the system's challenges would help her advocate for other struggling families. The children's adjustment to their new school had exceeded everyone's expectations. Emma had thrown herself into the environmental science program and was already talking about college scholarships that might be available through tribal educational funds. Jake had discovered a love of traditional crafts and was working with Thomas to build his own bow, determined to become as skilled as Danny. Danny himself had blossomed with the attention of older siblings, gaining confidence and social skills that would serve him well throughout his life. Elena watched her expanded family with satisfaction, seeing her lonely house transformed into a home filled with laughter, learning, and love. She had begun planning projects for the following year, including a larger garden that would feed the family and provide produce to sell at local markets, and a workshop where Thomas could teach traditional crafts while continuing his construction work. The practical challenges that had seemed so overwhelming just months earlier were now manageable obstacles that the family faced together. Sarah's debt was being paid off systematically with their combined income, and they were already saving money for a college fund that would benefit all three children. The house they were planning to build would incorporate both traditional techniques and modern sustainability features, creating a home that honored the past while embracing the future. Most remarkably, Sarah had rediscovered hope in ways she never expected. The desperate woman who had been ready to abandon everything had been transformed into someone who woke up each morning excited about the possibilities the day might bring. Her work with other struggling families was infused with the authenticity that comes from personal experience, and her advocacy was more effective because she understood both the challenges and the potential solutions. Thomas had found not just a wife, but a partner who understood his values and supported his dreams while contributing her own strengths to their shared vision. His son had gained not just siblings, but a larger family network that would provide stability and opportunities throughout his childhood and beyond. As the family prepared for bed on their wedding night, Danny approached Sarah with a serious expression that reminded her of that pivotal moment months earlier. This time, his whispered words were different but equally profound. "Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry my father. I knew you would make us all happy." Looking around at her new family, at Elena teaching Emma a traditional song while Thomas and Jake worked on Jake's bow, Sarah realized that hope had not just been restored but multiplied. Danny's innocent question had opened a door to a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she had dared to imagine during those dark days when abandoning hope had seemed like the only realistic option. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the simplest truths, spoken by children wise enough to see solutions that adults are too frightened or too proud to consider. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of changes that seemed to accelerate with each passing day. Sarah and her children began spending most of their free time at Elena's house, where the elderly woman had quietly begun preparing for the possibility of an expanded family. She taught Emma traditional beadwork and storytelling, skills that gave the serious girl a sense of connection to something larger than her immediate worries. Thomas found steady work with a construction company that specialized in sustainable building, partly because Sarah had helped him craft a resume that properly showcased his skills and cultural knowledge. Her professional background in social work proved invaluable in navigating the bureaucracy that had always intimidated him, while his practical knowledge of construction and traditional building methods opened up possibilities she had never considered. The children's school situation required careful planning, as Sarah wanted to ensure that the transition wouldn't disrupt their education. Emma was initially resistant to changing schools, worried about leaving the few friends she had made and starting over in a new environment. However, when she learned that the reservation school had a special program focusing on environmental science and cultural preservation, her academic interests were piqued. Jake adapted to the changes with the resilience that had always characterized his personality. He threw himself into learning everything Danny could teach him about traditional skills, while sharing his own knowledge of video games and modern technology. The two boys became inseparable, creating a friendship that seemed to bridge the gap between traditional and contemporary childhoods. As the practical details of blending their families began to take shape, Sarah and Thomas found themselves navigating conversations about money, living arrangements, and long-term goals. Thomas's family land included enough space to build a larger house that could accommodate everyone comfortably, and Sarah's education credentials could help her find steady work in social services. Once they were settled, the financial pressures that had been crushing Sarah began to ease as they pooled their resources and skills. Thomas's construction abilities meant they could build and maintain their home themselves, while Sarah's professional connections opened up opportunities for both of them to find more stable employment. More importantly, Elena's presence as an active grandmother figure provided childcare support that neither of them had enjoyed as single parents. Elena herself seemed to bloom with the prospect of a fuller household. She had been quietly lonely since her husband's death 5 years earlier, and the thought of teaching traditional ways to 3 grandchildren instead of 1 filled her with renewed purpose. She began planning garden expansions, craft projects, and cultural education activities that would benefit all the children. The bureaucratic challenges of their unusual situation required patience and creativity. Sarah's background in social work helped her navigate the legal requirements for marriage, property ownership, and blended family arrangements. She discovered that Thomas's status as a member of the Modoc tribe offered certain advantages in terms of land ownership and access to educational resources for the children. Thomas had never imagined that his life could change so dramatically in such a short time. The loneliness and financial stress that had defined his existence for the past 2 years were gradually being replaced by the comfortable chaos of a larger family. He found himself looking forward to coming home each day, knowing that Sarah would be there to share the daily triumphs and challenges of their expanding household. Sarah was discovering aspects of herself that had been buried under years of survival mode. Her natural nurturing instincts had room to flourish in this environment, where she was supported rather than struggling alone. She began to remember dreams she had abandoned, educational goals she had set aside, and the social work career she had always wanted to pursue in a meaningful way. The children's adjustment continued to amaze all the adults. Emma found herself taking on a big sister role with Danny that gave her a sense of purpose and leadership she had never experienced. Jake discovered that having 2 boys to play with expanded his world in ways he hadn't expected. Danny basked in the attention of older siblings who treated him as an equal partner in their adventures. As autumn approached, bringing with it the deadline for Sarah's eviction and the need to make final decisions about their future, the family held a series of meetings to discuss their plans. Elena facilitated these conversations with the wisdom of someone who understood that successful families were built on communication, mutual respect, and shared goals rather than just romantic feelings. The discussions revealed that everyone was committed to making this arrangement work, not just as a solution to their individual problems, but as the foundation for something better than any of them could achieve alone. Emma surprised everyone by stating that she felt more secure and hopeful than she had since her parents' divorce. Jake announced that he wanted to learn everything Danny's family could teach him about living close to the land. Thomas and Sarah realized that their relationship had evolved far beyond the practical partnership they had initially considered. They had fallen in love not just with each other, but with the family they were creating together. Danny's innocent question had opened a door to possibilities none of them had dared to imagine, and they were finally ready to walk through it together. The final decision came naturally, growing out of weeks of shared meals, cooperative parenting, and the gradual realization that they were already functioning as a family unit. When Thomas formally proposed marriage, it felt less like a romantic gesture and more like the official recognition of a reality they had all already accepted and embraced.